Hi everyone, well, thank you for having me here this evening and speak with you. Let me just tell you a little bit about my background and why it is that I'm now running for the United States Senate. Now, I live here in Weston. I was born in Haven. I didn't grow up though in Connecticut. We moved around quite a bit. I ended up out in California, graduated high school. I went to college up in Berkeley. I studied economics and finance. I was actually the only kid in the freshman dorm who had a poster of Ronald Reagan other than scoring points for the women. But I graduated and moved back down south, and I started working in the investment industry. I worked for a couple of smaller firms, and then I got a job with a major Wall Street banking house that just recently went bankrupt. And it is the only firm that they didn't bail out. It was one thing that we did right. But anyway, I worked there for a little while. And I quickly discovered that I didn't like it. I was a retail broker. I was working with individuals like people in this room. And I just didn't like the fact that the firm was wanting me to sell investment products that I didn't think were the best for the client. They had their own agenda, and oftentimes the client's interest was at odds with what the firm wanted. I didn't like that. So I left, and I started working on my own. And initially I worked out of my one-bedroom apartment in downtown Los Angeles, and I just cold called leads that I was able to acquire, and I tried to get brokerage accounts on my own. And over time, I started to notice, what was going on with the dot-coms and the internet stocks, and I thought it was very comical at first, and I watched these stocks go up, and I thought it was a huge bubble, and I became very nervous of a major collapse in the stock market when this whole thing unwound. And so probably in 1998 is when I really started just cold calling specifically on getting people out of tech stocks and NASDAQ stocks and trying to explain the fundamentals of investing and why these companies were just not viable and that they would collapse one day, and it was just a big Ponzi scheme. And it was very difficult because it was hard to do. Most people were arguing with me or they were laughing at me, and of course, the stocks kept going up, and so sometimes people would remind me of how much money I was losing by not being in these stocks. But of course, some people listened to me, and I started opening up accounts one at a time, and I was buying, basic businesses, low PEs, good dividend yields. I was staying out of tech and the internet. And 2000, when the bubble finally burst, and the collapse pretty much came the way I predicted. I had forecasted the NASDAQ would drop 80 to 90%, and that's exactly what it did. And I forecast that 90% of the dot-coms would go bankrupt, and more than that probably went bankrupt. And so when that happened, I got a lot of vindication for years of, telling my clients what was going to happen, and I was able to expand my business. I was calling back. I had a long list of people who I had talked to over the years, who I had warned to get out of these stocks, and many of those clients ultimately became accounts with whatever money they had left. Some of them, unfortunately, were broke, but those that, didn't lose too much, I opened up some accounts. And ultimately, during that process, I had moved out of my apartment, and I opened up an office. Initially, it was just me. And now, fast forward to today, I've got over 100 employees. I have 6 offices across the country. My clients have invested better than $2 billion with me. I'm doing not only retail brokerage, I'm also doing investment banking, I'm doing asset management. And part of my background and what I bring to the Senate race that I think is unique is I combine that entrepreneurial experience. Right? I've grown this business from zero. I started it from scratch, and it's now a pretty viable business. I understand what it takes to grow and manage a business. And I also understand all the harm that government can do and all the obstructions that it puts in your place. The regulation in the financial services industry has grown so dramatically over the years that had the regulatory structure that exists today been in place when I first started, I never could have done it. It would have been impossible. I didn't have the money. I now have 7 people that work for me, and the only thing those 7 people do is comply with government rules and regulations. That's it. Now, if I didn't have to hire those 7 people, I'd probably have another 50 or 100 people doing productive things. I also have large legal bills and accounting bills. All of that is to comply with government rules and regulations that undermine my productivity and do nothing to protect the investor. In fact, they actually harm the investor. All they're doing is protecting these gigantic firms because they're making it harder for small firms like me to compete. Fortunately, I've grown large enough that I can now afford all this regulation. But a lot of smaller companies that are just getting started can't. But the other thing that's unique about my background is not only do I understand businesses and how to run businesses, but I understand economics, I understand finance. in my job as trying to give my clients investment advice, I'm constantly looking around the world and judging the effects of monetary and fiscal policy on economic growth. I'm looking at the things that governments do that inhibit growth and trying to avoid investing in those areas. And I'm looking for countries that are going to do better because the governments are staying out of the markets more. And that knowledge of economics and markets led me to make some forecasts with respect to the current economic crisis. Back in 2004, I became very worried about the housing bubble. I had initially expected housing prices to fall in 2000 when the dot-com bubble burst. I assumed that when the stock market plunged, that housing prices would go down too. That was normally what happened. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen because the Federal Reserve didn't let it happen, because they slashed interest rates irresponsibly down to 1%, and they inflated the housing bubble. And by 2004, I was convinced that it was going to end in tears. I was watching what was going on in the mortgage market. I saw that Freddie and Fannie were guaranteeing adjustable rate mortgages that I knew would eventually reset, and I knew the people who were borrowing the money couldn't repay. I was renting a house at the time, and I saw that the prices of condos that I was renting doubling during the couple of years that I was renting, and my rent was a fraction of what the mortgage payments were, so I knew it didn't make any sense. So I started writing op-eds in newspapers warning about this ticking time bomb of adjustable rate mortgages, and that the Fed had better raise interest rates quickly, or it was going to create this big housing bubble, and the longer they kept rates down, the worse it would get. And I warned about what was going on in the securitized debt market. I warned about the fraud in the appraisals and the fraud in the rating agencies, pretty much everything that ultimately happened. And it started getting so big, I was going to write a book specifically on the housing market. I was going to write a book called The Coming American Nightmare, and I was thinking about ways to do it. And then I decided to make the book broader in scope. I wanted to write a book about the economy in general, so housing became one chapter. It was the coming real estate debacle, and I wrote about it in depth, but I also wrote about the housing market throughout the book. But it was a broader book called Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. That book was written from mid-2005 to mid-2006, and it hit the bookshelves in February of 2007. Now also at that time, I started going on television. I started going on CNBC. I made my first appearance in 2005. And I started coming on every week. I was doing CNN, I was doing Fox, I was doing Bloomberg. I was probably one of the most frequent guests on cable news shows. And CNBC started calling me Dr. Doom, because I was forecasting this massive economic collapse. I said we were headed for the greatest recession since the Great Depression, that we'd have double-digit unemployment. I talked about General Motors going bankrupt. I talked about Fannie and Freddie going bankrupt. I made a lot of forecasts that people thought were impossible. I focused a lot on the housing bubble and what was going to happen when it burst. I focused on what that was going to do to our financial industry. I thought it was going to take down the banking sector. And I focused on what the government was going to do to exacerbate the problem. And unfortunately, everything that I said happened. The government is now making all the same mistakes that they made in 2001 and 2002 that created the housing bubble, that led to the financial crisis of 2008. They are stimulating the economy in the same way. You see, if the government had stayed out after the dot-com bubble burst, which of course they also created with cheap money, but if they had let that dot-com bubble burst and let the recession flow naturally, we would have repaired the damage. The damage was the crazy boom, when people were investing in all those crazy companies. That was the mistake. The recession is where the market was going to purge those mistakes and then get prepared for real economic growth. But the government, for political reasons, did not let that happen. And so they artificially stimulated the economy with cheap money and deficit spending, and they created that bubble that led to that burst. And now they're doing the same thing all over again. Interest rates are now 1% instead of 0 instead of 1%. They're lower. We're doing even more damage. It's a bigger stimulus. And of course, the deficit spending is now off the charts. And the Federal Reserve has blown its balance sheet. It's got trillions of dollars of toxic assets on its books. So the stimulus is much bigger. And so the crisis that our government is in the process of creating is going to be far worse than the one they think they solved. And the reason that I want to go to Washington, the reason I think it's so important that I go there, is because there's not a single senator that understands this. We've got this gigantic fire that's blazing, and all they can think of is to throw gasoline on it. And they don't understand that the more gasoline they put on it, the bigger the fire's going to get. I want to go to Washington and stop that from happening, because the real economic crisis is not over. It's coming. It might even hit before I get there. It might happen in 2010. But if it doesn't happen in 2010, 2011